I spend a lot of my time alone, which I really value. Um, but I find that I have to have balance. I need to have a certain amount of time to myself, but then I also like to uh, go out and socialize. When I am around other people, it's usually been my tendency to be very slow at coming out of my shell when I'm getting to know, especially new people. Um, so I'm usually uh, very soft-spoken at first, keep to myself, and I'm in a place of observation more than participation. And because of this, I'm often labeled as an introvert. And from what I've observed is that it would seem that there's more people who identify as introverts than as extroverts, which isn't to suggest that there are more introverts than extroverts, but rather that being extroverted is considered just so normal that if you are someone who's extroverted, you probably just don't really think about these sorts of things. But introversion is much more noticeable, I think, and that people who tend to be more introverted are more self-aware of it, because it's very noticeable that you aren't engaging with other people to the same degree that everyone else is. And you may not be engaging with other people at all. You may be spending all of your time alone. And in some cases we might see that as being problematic, because maybe you want to be more social in certain situations, but the habit to remain reserved and in the background is so strong that sometimes it's difficult to come out of that place. So just to clarify before I go on, I want to just explain very quickly some of the traits of being introverted and extroverted. Extroversion describes an outgoing personality, someone who is highly social, energetically engaged with others, and usually very talkative and outspoken. Introversion describes a more reserved or withdrawn personality, someone who is much more solitary rather than socially outgoing, someone who is more observant and reflective and contemplative, who is often quiet or soft-spoken. Now, as I was saying before, it does seem that there are more people who take to the identification of introvert than there are who take to the identification of extrovert, although there are people who do tend to identify strongly as one or the other. And as I said before, I'm often labeled as an introvert, but I personally reject that label. It's true that I do tend to be primarily introverted, but that's not always the case. And I find that labels are often very constricting and limiting and actually prevent growth. So if I identify as an introvert, then I confine myself to those traits. And if I happen to someday I'm behaving extroverted, then it's as if it's some strange temporary phenomena. But if I don't identify myself as one or the other, and I'm merely identifying the behavior, then it's my behavior that is either introverted or extroverted. And that can change and fluctuate according to different situations and many other factors. In fact, I find often in my life that I sort of go through waves of being very introverted and then being very extroverted. And those waves can be, we're talking in terms of days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, and sometimes years. And even recently, I've been, for quite a long time, for years, I would say, I've been primarily introverted, and I'm in a place now where I'm observing that I'm coming out of it slightly. To what degree, I'm not certain, but there's definitely been some noticeable shift recently. So by seeing it this way, as identifying introversion or extroversion as a behavior or a personality trait, rather than identifying oneself as introvert or extrovert, there's much more flexibility. And not only can we shift between being solitary and then in the next moment social, depending on our mood or just where we're at or who we're around, but it also allows for growth over time. So even if I'm primarily introverted right now at this particular time in my life, over time I could shift to becoming more and more extroverted, because I'm not confining myself to this label. I'm not inhibited by the belief that I can only be one way or the other. The reality is that my behavior is both introverted and extroverted, but which of these is more prevalent just depends on the circumstances in the moment, as well as what I'm feeling in that moment. So I notice this with a lot of people, that we tend to confuse emotions, beliefs, and behaviors with who we are, and that we strongly identify with the behavior. And I find that this is very limiting. As soon as you label yourself as one thing or the other, it's very difficult to shift and evolve. So I think it's fine, again, to label the behavior, to label thought patterns and that kind of thing. But at the same time, to understand that thoughts and behavior are something that is happening within you and through you, but that you are the space in which all of it is taking place. And that means that you're simply not defined by those things. These things are passing, and they can change and shift and evolve, but that's not who you really are. So for example, I might say I'm happy or I'm sad, but happiness and sadness are passing emotions. And I don't know that I've ever met anybody who is constantly 100% sad or happy all of the time. So there's always moments where these emotions shift. So if I say I'm happy or I'm sad, I'm identifying with the emotion. The reality is that I'm not happy or sad. Happiness and sadness are happening. Happiness and sadness are something that I'm experiencing, but they're not who I am. Because if you think that being sad is who you are, then all these problems arise. And you can actually become resistant to happiness when it shows up. I know there's times in my life when I said to myself, I'm depressed, and if I was in a situation where people were, just very giddy and perhaps, and having fun and maybe joking, I might have felt within me some impulse to smile and laugh, but there was a part of me that was like, no, you have to hold that back. You can't smile and laugh. You're depressed. So, so this is what I'm saying. And then it also on the other end, if you think that happy is who you are, then when sadness shows up, you think that there's something wrong with you. So I give those as examples, but all of this applies again to identifying as either being an introvert or an extrovert. If you think you're an introvert, then this identification can make it very difficult to open up and be more socially outgoing, because you believe that you're not capable of that, or just simply that it's not who you are. So it's much more difficult then to be flexible and to shift according to the situation. But again, it's not who you are. And when you realize this, you can really allow for that flexibility. You can behave in ways that don't fit the definition, and it doesn't have to feel strange because you're not confined by those traits. As an indefinitely flexible being, you can behave in whatever way comes naturally in that moment. So even if you deeply value solitude, like I do, and there's nothing wrong with that, you don't have to feel like you're strange because everyone's out socializing and you'd rather stay in and read or work on a project or whatever it might be. And then if your mood shifts and you feel like going out and being social, you can embrace and really open up to that without having to feel like you're not really being yourself, that it's outside of your established abilities, or that you have to put on an act, that you have to pretend to be social because that's not who you really are. You can just allow your energy to just shift in whatever way it naturally wants to flow, and whether that's conserving and internalizing or expressing and sharing it with others.